Please pray with me. May these words that I speak be grounded in my soul, encouraged by the God presence in me. And may these words that you hear be captured by your soul, enlivened by the God presence in you. Amen. There was a time not so long ago when I couldn't stand these birth stories, these stories of Mary and angels and stars in Bethlehem. I realize now that was because I knew they weren't historically true, that they made the story into some kind of miracle. But I didn't appreciate then how important these birth stories are in really understanding the life of Jesus and the wisdom and the way of God. And still, these stories are not true history. The danger is significant when we choose to believe these birth stories as fact. Believing in a virgin birth in Bethlehem, in stars that stop in their tracks, in physicalized angels, in shepherds and stables, and most significantly, in Jesus as something other than human, turns the life of Jesus into what you might call a series of carnival tricks. Believing all this to be historically true diminishes the most important aspect of Jesus' life, his humanness. He stood out in his lifetime not because he was less human than the rest of us, but because he was incredibly more human than the rest of us. He committed wholeheartedly to living love, unconditional love and compassion, the way and the wisdom of God. We know, in fact, that the birth stories are intentionally metaphorical if we look at the earlier Gospel of Mark and the letters of Paul, which were the earliest record of the story of Jesus. And it was clear there that Jesus was born of Mary in Nazareth. There was no Joseph, no stable, no angels, but each subsequent author, Luke, Matthew, and John, writing years and decades after Jesus' life, felt they needed to grow the story as the years passed and memory faded. What they tried to capture in metaphor was the transformational way that Jesus lived. Jesus embodied the presence of God within his human body and life, and he lived so deeply and loved so completely that they needed more than human events to try to capture the incredible way that this simple peasant man from Nazareth lived his life. Committed to love wholeheartedly. Committed to God wholeheartedly. Committed to life wholeheartedly. Understanding the stories and understanding Jesus this way does not make Jesus less important. Rather, it makes him more important. It changes our relationship with him. It seems to me that as long as Jesus is not one of us, we can excuse ourselves from living like him. Because after all, he's not human like us, is he? But when we acknowledge Jesus as one of us, we must choose to live like him, to live each and every moment of our lives wholeheartedly. I want to show you a video clip which is about living wholeheartedly, thanks to Julie, who forwarded it on this week. The speaker is Brené Brown, who is an American scholar, author, and public speaker. She is currently one of the research professors at the University of Houston, and her specialty is in social work and socialization. So hear what she has to say.
What's wholeheartedness versus like half-heartedness, and how do you cultivate wholeheartedness, whatever that is?
I love that you ask. I love your question. What is wholeheartedness, and is the opposite of that half-heartedness? I never thought about what the opposite of wholeheartedness was when I came up with that concept for my work. I was just looking at the men and women who, despite the scarcity in our culture, despite the perfectionism, despite the pressure to hustle, these were men and women who woke up every day and said, you know what? I'm scared, I'm imperfect, I'm vulnerable, but that doesn't change the fact that I am worthy of love and belonging, and I'm brave. And so I said, that sounds like wholeheartedness to me. And honestly, that phrase comes from the Book of Common Prayer in the Episcopal Church. During one of our prayers, we say, we have not loved you with our whole hearts. And I came to that phrase because I thought these were men and women living and loving with their whole hearts. And so and that phrase came up for me, I think maybe 2009, 2010. And as I've kept writing about wholeheartedness, I do think the opposite of it is half-heartedness, where it's a half-hearted effort, meaning I didn't put my whole self into it because I tried to hedge my bet so that if it didn't work out, I wouldn't be as hurt. And the only thing worse than failure, a wholehearted failure, is a half-hearted failure. Because at least with a wholehearted failure, I can say, damn, I was all in and I gave it everything. And this hurt so much, but I was all in and I'm proud of that. But when I have failed in the past, and I've had some big failures, professional and personal, and they were half-hearted, and I had to look back and say, God, I failed. That really hurts. And it even hurts more because I know I didn't put everything into it. I didn't take the risk. So I do think the choices are wholehearted, put yourself out there, show up, love big, or it's half-hearted. And I think we think that by protecting that half of our heart, we'll get less hurt, but I don't think that's true.
Wholeheartedness, she said, is about loving big. Putting our whole heart, soul, and our mind into the way we live. Risking it all for love. This is the way that Jesus lived, making him an integral part of the never-ending story of love. We have no way of knowing what happened when Mary realized she was pregnant. We have no way of knowing who the actual father was and what role he played, and it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. What Luke is offering us in this story of an angel is a larger-than-life example of what it means to face a life circumstance, whatever it is, and enter into it wholeheartedly. To live deeply and to live passionately. Mary's, how can this be, to the angel, is transformed through her wholehearted commitment to love into full acceptance of her life as it unfolds. Jesus' story, his whole story, from beginning to end, is about living wholeheartedly and loving wholeheartedly. It is why he is remembered, revered, and even adored. If Jesus' commitment to love, if Jesus' commitment to God had been half-hearted, there would be no angels, no Mary, no Bethlehem, no shepherds, no stable, no star. Luke's story becomes a beautiful and creative response to what it means to live wholeheartedly, to love completely. And the story isn't written just so we might know 2,000 years later how great Jesus was, although that's really important. More importantly, or at least equally as important, although many have forgotten, is that Jesus' story of loving wholeheartedly is intended to call us to do exactly the same. And the good news is, it is already happening in our world. We see the news and we tend to think that the world is getting less loving, less compassionate, especially the last number of months with all that we hear about terror and refugees. It feels like the world is getting less loving, less compassionate, because the news nearly always focuses on the worst things that are going on. But this continual bad news story is as far from the truth as Luke's story of Bethlehem. Bruce Sangwin, in his book, The Advance of Love, writes about the growth of compassion and empathy this last 50 years in our world, in the last 50 years. And he says, humans have undergone a virtual explosion of the empathetic impulse since the 1960s. The particular line of intelligence that has been awakened is empathy. We allowed ourselves to show our sensitivity as a species, our essential neighborliness. We recognized that we have a heart. He goes on to give a small but very clear example of how this empathy has grown, how compassion and love have grown in the world. He says, in 1958, 2 black boys in North Carolina, aged 7 and 9, were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 14 years in prison after a white girl had kissed them. Imagine. According to research, by 1987, only 49% of Americans agreed with the statement, "I think it's all right for blacks and whites to date each other." Only 49%. And 25% said they had little in common with people of other races. By 2003, 77% of people said it was all right for blacks and whites to date each other. What about interracial marriage? In 1958, the year those boys were imprisoned, only 4% of whites approved of intermarriage with blacks. By 1997, 67% of whites approved of intermarriage between blacks and whites. And for those born after 1976, the issue of skin color virtually becomes a non-issue. Hallelujah. The racist, bigoted, and fear-mongering rantings of Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump would suggest that this change is not true. But this is an angry and fearful little man, very little man, that has been given way too much attention. Worse than half-hearted, he demonstrates no-heartedness, no compassion, no empathy. And I say to you that this way is not the way of God. He will not succeed, my friends. Oh, he may become the next president of the United States, but he will not succeed. Love will prevail. It always does. Look to the bigger change at work in the world beyond the stories driven by fear. And look to the bigger news of the even more rapid explosion of compassion and empathy in our world. Love. Love is the never-ending story. We are being called as we approach Christmas yet again to become an active part of that story of love. We are being called, like Mary, to choose to love wholeheartedly. And we are being called, like Jesus, to live wholeheartedly. Yes, Virginia, there is good news. And it is called the never-ending story of love. Amen.